Can you turn me on?
You're on. You're on. You're on.
Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, Sustainable Claremont. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming out tonight. I also start with an apology from my colleague, Robert Hall, we're planning to do this together, and I talked to him a few hours ago. He's home very sick, and he has been sick and in the hospital for the last week. He is recovering, and he told me he would much prefer to be here with us. The main point I want to make, and I'll speak for a while, and then we can have a two-way discussion, is good news. We do have a remarkably attractive solution or major step forward toward dealing with the climate change problem. And to develop this main point, I have 4 subpoints that you see up there. We have a serious problem, climate change, remarkably attractive solution. Once again. Okay, now we're in business. So there are the 4 points. I'll give you a bunch more information. Some of it may be a review for some. This, however, is the only thing that will be on the quiz, so you don't have to worry about the rest. So first, the bad news. Climate change, as you know, is real. And it is us. It's not primarily due to natural forces. And it's not just a problem for the long-term future. It's now. The impacts are already breaking upon us. For example, 2015, a survey of American lung doctors reported that a majority of them today are already seeing patients who they believe are sicker because of climate change. And the health impacts are not limited to lung disease. There are cardiovascular implications, foodborne diseases, making the world safer for infectious diseases like West Nile virus and Zika virus, and mental health problems due to people being thrown out of their homes by flooding and so forth. The physical features of our world are disappearing, including the glaciers in Glacier National Park. These 2 pictures are in the same place in Alaska. On the left, 1941. On the right, 2004. All that ice melted and flowed down eventually toward the oceans. Also on the Arctic Sea, summer ice in the summertime is 40% less than it was several years ago. And that means that ice is bright, so it reflects a lot of heat back. Water is dark, so it absorbs a lot more heat, so it sets up a vicious cycle. More heat, more melting of the ice, bigger black surfaces, etc. The worst worries in this respect are in Antarctica and Greenland, which are the largest quantities of frozen fresh water on land on the planet. And already on the top of Greenland, there are big blue lakes where this same vicious cycle is at work. As a result, we know the sea level is rising. It's also rising faster than the models had predicted. The city of Miami Beach has already raised some of their streets by 2 to 3 feet. We're also making the oceans more acidic. This is a picture of an island in the Central Pacific, a nation state called Kiribati. Its president has said it's already too late to save my country. And he's already bought some land on Fiji, a slightly larger island, for the eventual migration. Of course, around the coasts of the world, there are hundreds of millions of people, not just a few in Fiji, who are living near the coastline and not far above sea level. One American think tank has taken their climate models and projected, for given amounts of global warming, how much ice would melt, how much sea levels would rise, and then produced maps all over the world to show what it would look like. And I just selected Shanghai, China, where there are 23 million people living today. It's mostly flat at the end of a river, the mouth of a river. And what it shows on the right side is what Shanghai will look like once global warming reaches 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That's the UN target for stopping global warming. We're already at about 1 degree Celsius of global warming since the Industrial Revolution. And all the blue area is underwater. Only the the yellowish colors, land, is still sticking up above the ocean. And that's 2 degrees. On the left is 4 degrees Celsius, where almost the entire city will be inundated. So that's 23 million people today, means a massive humanitarian catastrophe, huge property loss, and the Chinese government knows very well that this is what climate change means for China. Unprecedented refugee pressure. It's been estimated that between 300 million and 650 million people today live on coastal territory that is likely to be inundated by 2100 on present emission trajectories. And on the other side of the Pacific, this is Santa Monica, California, and down on the lower right you can see LAX in Santa Monica. Have you been to Santa Monica? Let's see here. This is the pier. This is LAX, Marina del Rey, and at 2 degrees Celsius, the pier and the beach and the cliffs and much of downtown Santa Monica will be inundated. This think tank says we can't give you a date by which there will be this much sea rise because they don't have enough confidence in their models about the speed of melting with given temperatures. But they say that at 2 degrees, this much flooding is locked in someday, however long it takes. And this would be 4 degrees. So the flooding is all the way back east of the 405 freeway in Santa Monica. And personally,
Can I ask what level of sea rise has been projected for 4 degrees? How many feet?
I'd have to look up the number of feet, I guess. All I have is these diagrams. But let me make a note about that.
I believe it's 6 to 7 feet
6 to 7 feet worldwide.
on average.
Okay. As we trap more heat energy in our atmosphere, we are driving up the number of extreme climate events. Since 1980, they have quadrupled by 2014, and we're still turning up the heat. As we know, in California, part of this global warming means more frequent extreme heat waves, which do actually kill people sometimes. We know that as the air gets warmer, it dries out the topsoil faster, so we have more frequent extreme droughts, not only in California, but around the world. As trees dry out for years at a time, and then a fire starts, perhaps for natural reasons, the fires become more intense. They burn more territory before they have a chance to put it out, and it costs way more federal budget to put them out. And the worst part is that some of these wildfires, the trees are not coming back as they used to. Bad news because, as you know, they absorb carbon dioxide. So another vicious cycle. We heat the atmosphere, burn the trees, and then they don't absorb, and then we have more heating, more burning, etc. The warmer the air, Freeman should be giving this lecture, the more water vapor it holds, one of the basic findings of atmospheric chemistry. And so as global warming proceeds, the air is moister, including in the winter. So when a storm comes into New England in the winter, the snow dump is greater. Because of global warming, you can't prove it's not true by throwing a snowball across the floor of the U.S. Senate. And if it's warmer than that, we get extreme rainfall, rain bombs, and flooding. This was just a year ago on the other side of the San Gabriel Mountains in northern LA County. Extreme rainfall, mudslides. These people had to get out of their cars to escape to get home in the afternoon. Also, this year, in the spring of 2016, hundreds of people in China, in eastern China, died in such flooding incidents. Then there was that summer incident when in the Louvre Museum had to raise some paintings above the first floor, preparing for flooding on the Seine. And then Central Texas, Louisiana, you remember those pictures in Louisiana, Wisconsin, and South Carolina all had such events just this year. Climate change means more frequent extreme hurricanes and typhoons. When the seawater on the surface is warmer and the hurricane moves across it, it picks up more heat energy and it gets more powerful and larger. They called this one a superstorm because it was 900 miles across, just about a third of the width of the whole country. And the sea level was higher, so the storm surge was also higher, and it did enormous amounts of property destruction. And this is Breezy Point, New York, after Hurricane Sandy. The second most costly storm on record after Hurricane Katrina in the world. The next year, the Philippines was hit by the largest to that date typhoon, destroying more property and businesses. We are also threatening international security by continuing global warming. This is Admiral Samuel Locklear III, who was Commander-in-Chief of all U.S. forces in the Pacific in 2013. And he was in Boston and was asked by a reporter, what do you think will be the greatest long-term threat to security in the Pacific region? And he did not say North Korea, and he didn't say China's relations with its neighbors. He said, quote, an upheaval related to climate change is probably the most likely thing that's going to disturb international security. He says in the not-too-distant future, we're looking at the danger of large-scale population movements due to climate change. The scientists have also identified possible worst cases, processes that have really never been seen, never been modeled, but that once started could accelerate climate change so rapidly that in geological time it would be well beyond the capacity of human beings to adapt. One of them is sudden faster melting of Antarctica and Greenland, which could raise sea levels by several meters over the entire globe eventually if they all melted completely. Another possible tipping point is in northern Russia's permafrost. There's enormous amounts of carbon, been frozen for thousands and thousands of years. It's starting to thaw on the surface. If it should all thaw in a few decades or a couple of centuries, enormous releases of additional CO2 into the atmosphere. The scientists don't agree about how likely these extreme cases are. They do agree about all the basic points. So they're not included in the models that we are looking at, like these flooding models. But it keeps me awake at night. Okay, so that's the bad news. We all know that climate change is a serious problem. But I do want to tell you about this remedy. When I read about this plan on the web, I was so impressed with it that I decided I'd better join the organization, Citizens Climate Lobby, and so I did. It has three key elements: a carbon fee, a dividend, and a border adjustment. Part one is that it would be a federal law. The U.S. Treasury would collect a fee on the production or import of coal, oil, and natural gas in proportion to the amount of CO2 embedded in the fuel. Starting low, too low to solve the problem, but to give time for the economy to adjust, $15 per ton of CO2 in the fuel in the first year. But the second year, it would go up by $10 to $25 a ton. Third year, $35 a ton. It would go up by $10 a ton every year, indefinitely. Secondly, and of course, eventually, producers of these fuels and of goods using the fuels to make them and transport them would have to pass on price increases, which is the idea, pricing carbon. Then secondly, under this plan, the Treasury would turn around and send the money to us. They would send the money in dividends, monthly dividends to every American household on equal per capita basis. And you would be free to do what you want with your money. And as the fee goes up every year, the dividend goes up every year. So how much money are we talking about, Professor? Here's an illustration from a consultant report that we commissioned for this study. Taking a family of 2 adults and 2 kids under 19, the kids would be eligible for a half an adult share up to 2 kids in our plan. In the first year, it works out, if they had started last year and this was the first year, the monthly dividend for that family would be about $45 a month. when the fee is at its lowest. But as you see, it keeps going up. And in the 20th year, it's almost $400 a month in today's dollars. So the average household income in the United States is about $52,000. This would be $4,700 a year in the 20th year. So it's not just mad money, it's serious money. But even better, this plan is designed to be fair so that low-income families would actually be insulated from the cost of the rising cost of the carbon fee by the dividend. Dividends are equal, but low-income families have smaller carbon footprints than high-income families. And so in the first year, a study we had done that covers only 1 year shows that all of these groups would actually get more in a dividend than they would pay in higher costs due to the carbon fee. 90% of the poor families, 2/3 of elderly families, 2/3 of young households would actually get more back in the dividend than they're paying in higher gasoline and electricity prices. And this is not counting the gains from avoiding worse damage from climate change, which is really the object here anyway, and it's not counted in the dollars. Also doesn't count the fact that after the first year, we all have the opportunity to adjust, to reduce our carbon footprints, and keep more of our dividends. Why would this work? Why would this plan work? Well, maybe I'll just go on first and present the main summary national results. If this plan were adopted, looking at year 20, the modelers forecast what would happen in the economy and the environment without this plan, and then a second forecast compared with the baseline. We would cut our carbon emissions in half in the first 20 years. This is far more than President Obama could promise last year in the UN without new legislation. We would save over 200,000 premature deaths due to lung disease by moving away from dirty fuels this way. And most interesting, perhaps, this plan would actually expand the U.S. economy. With the plan in place in year 20, the GDP would be larger than if it's not enacted, and we would have 2,800,000 more jobs net than if it's not enacted. That's after subtracting jobs that would be lost, some jobs in the fossil fuel sector. Why would this work? The price of carbon, attaches a price to carbon, so it captures the full social cost of burning the fuels in the price for the first time, and it makes it more costly to use fossil fuels. And the rising prices for the goods that use them will drive everybody to save money. It mobilizes the financial power of the entire U.S. economy to decarbonize gradually over several decades by driving everybody to lower cost alternatives. We know from economics that as the cost of something goes up, demand falls in general. On the second time, the dividend at the same time acts as a stimulus to consumer spending. Most people will spend their dividends, and they'll spend it on things that people spend them on. So there'll be expanded business and jobs in retail, in healthcare, in construction, in vehicle manufacturing, in furniture manufacturing, in the hotel and entertainment industries. All of these areas will see some, at least small, increases in jobs because of the consumer spending. Now you're probably asking yourself, what about international trade? And if you're not, I'm going to ask it anyway. If we enact the two domestic parts of this plan, and then we're going to be raising gradually the costs of U.S. producers in international trade, and if they're competing with imports from countries that lack similar carbon pricing, they will be gradually getting a disadvantage as their costs go up. And they will figure this out before this goes through Congress, and they will block the bill from passing Congress in the first place. And so we add a third element, the border adjustment. This would authorize the president to collect an additional duty on imports coming from countries that lack similar pricing on carbon. The amount of the duty would be equal to the rising cost domestically due to our domestic carbon fee and no higher. So it would not actually be protectionist. Otherwise, we would be encouraging imports and discriminating against U.S. producers and encouraging them to ship jobs overseas. We don't want to do that. So we want to keep the competitive relationship the same. So that would be the third element. this adjustment could be written so it would be consistent with the rules of the World Trade Organization. And if you're interested in the details on that, I can say more about that. One of the things that really struck me when I first read about this plan on the web was I thought this is brilliant politically, because what we need is a plan that Republicans and Democrats and independents can support, at least enough of them in the Congress to pass it. And it's written really to respond to the objections made to earlier proposals. And so it strikes me as this proposal could be a Republican bill in the U.S. Congress. A Republican member of Congress could say, in introducing this bill, we believe that the solution to climate change needs to respect market forces and not have a bunch of subsidies and regulations that will be directing which companies and technologies win in the energy sector. And so we propose this fee that rises. It's written into federal law. It's predictable. Every company and investor knows it's coming. And then they compete. And the industries and the technologies that do the best win. And that's the way we like to run an economy. This plan will not increase regulations. They hate regulations. It will not increase government spending. The government doesn't keep the money in this plan. It all goes back to the public, and no new subsidies. The carbon fee and the dividend are relatively simple to write, easy to monitor, hard to rig through later lobbying. There's not much left to, no regulations needed that could be subject to lobbying. At the same time, progressives can support this because it does insulate low-income and a lot of middle-income families from the costs of the transition, considering that they're not responsible for most of the carbon pollution. So the Bernie Sanders people can live with this, can like it. I would also argue to them that this has a better chance of passing Congress than any new regulations, including cap and trade. I believe cap and trade is dead on arrival in Congress in Washington, and it was before the current elections. And I would say that this also gets us more abatement of pollution than any other plan on the horizon that I know of. But then you may be wondering, well, this thing has to stay in place for decades, and it's going to be raising people's gasoline prices. Isn't some politician going to stand up after it's passed and say, vote for me and I will repeal this thing that's raising your gasoline taxes? Yes, somebody will do that. But somebody else will stand up right after that and say, this guy wants to take away your dividend. Is that what you want? No. This way of doing it will build a constituency, just like Social Security has. Voters who will vote to defend this law against repeal attempts, so it will have a better chance of being politically sustainable over long periods as well as environmentally sustainable. And I don't know of any other way of doing it that would be as strong in this sense. There are other ways of spending the revenue of a carbon tax that are taken seriously by economists and policy experts, but in my opinion, they are more vulnerable to this threat of repeal later. At an earlier meeting, some members of Sustainable Claremont heard this proposal and had some very sophisticated, detailed questions about it. And I brought answers to all these questions if there's interest in these during our discussion. How specifically is carbon fee and dividend better than cap and trade? How would the border adjustment work with our trade agreements? What share of the new jobs would pay lower or higher wages? Estimated cost for administration? And should the fee be exempt petroleum that's not burned because it's incorporated into plastic and asphalt? But I'd like to move on now to point number 3. The effective barrier to this proposal, why Washington hasn't adopted it, is really not because we don't have the adequate technology for dealing with climate change. If our present technologies were spread all over the world, in effect, we would have much bigger step toward dealing with climate change than we have now. And it's also not because it's uneconomic to do it, as you've just seen. This way of doing it would actually improve the economy. We're going to be losing money if we don't do this. Obviously, the barriers are political, and but there is some political good news here as well. I think maybe the most fundamental bad news in the politics is that the two parties have built their supportive coalitions on opposite sides of this issue, and they turn to those coalitions for support in campaigns, and they use the issue to try to defeat each other. It's kind of institutionalized in the two parties. Even before Mr. Trump won the nomination in the Republican Party, and there's a lot of distrust and hostility in Washington, as you know. And then in addition, clearly it seems from what we know now that Trump's defeat of Clinton is bad news for proposals like this, and perhaps for lots of climate action. We don't have all the information we need to make that judgment, but we do have some. We have what he said in his campaign. He said his policy for energy was going to be to promote American energy independence by increasing production of fossil fuels as well as non-fossil, non-carbon fuels. Carbon fee and dividend is designed to reduce production and use of fossil fuels. So the opposite of what we want. If he sticks to that, he would veto our bill even if it passed the Republican House and the Republican Senate. He has started announcing appointments. Oh, in his campaign, he's also said he would reverse any job-killing executive actions President Obama has taken. He would cancel the Paris Agreement and the other commitments that the U.S. has made to live up to international climate agreements. He has announced a few appointments. The key appointments for this issue area will be Treasury, EPA, and Energy, plus State Department and possibly Commerce Department will have a lever on the process, and of course the White House staff. The appointments we know about, he has appointed the Treasury Secretary. He's named his nominee for the Treasury, and Mr. Mnuchin is an unknown on this issue. We don't know anything about his position on it. In fact, most financial people don't know anything about him. But he's not a known denier. He hasn't announced his appointments to EPA or Energy, but he has announced the leaders of the transition teams to select these personnel. And both of them are vocal, long-term climate deniers. Of all the people he could have chosen to pick his EPA team, he picked a think tank employee in Washington who has been doing his best to spread disinformation about the science, paid for partly by fossil interests. And to run his Energy Department transition team, he picked a former lawyer of Koch Industries. So those are the people who are advising him. We'll have to see who he ends up selecting. In the White House, in the CIA, Mike Pompeo is a congressman from Kansas who's received a lot of money from the Koch Industries. Sitting outside Trump's door will be General Flynn and Stephen Bannon, and both of them have been climate deniers in public. So you might say it's bad news and we might as well just give up, unless you think somebody might block some of these initiatives or even persuade the new administration in Congress to adopt a Republican climate action plan. But what's the likelihood of that, Professor? Well, hold on a minute. Consider a few elements of possible political good news as well. Public opinion wants Washington to act on climate, and favors our approach. The trends in the economy are moving away from carbon. Investments are being made by companies. Some Republican leaders are calling for solutions, and the entire world pledged concrete steps for climate action last December in Paris. So on those points, here's a survey from January 2015, asked the public, should the U.S. government do more about global warming, do less, or about the same? Only 19% said less. 61% said they want Washington to do more. It's a 3-to-1 margin. It seems to me that deniers have failed with the general public. You might not know that watching television or reading the news on your computer, but this has been repeated in later surveys since then. Of course, the number among Republicans, the number who say do more, is lower than 61%, but it's not trivial. There's a substantial minority of Republican voters who say they want Washington to do more to save them from climate change. I believe many Trump voters would prefer to be saved from property loss and illness from climate change. Clinton and Trump never debated this issue. It's hard to argue that people were voting for Trump because they wanted more carbon pollution, especially if they were to get a better chance of getting a job from our plan. It's also a fact that 54% of the public voted against Mr. Trump. So it would be hard, I think, to convince me anyway, that he has a mandate to reverse all these measures. The survey also asked people, would you support a carbon tax if the revenue was fully rebated to the American public? 69% said that sounds pretty good, a 2-to-1 margin. And you don't get much better than that on public policy issues, very specific questions like this. Now, there is a political problem when we lobby in Washington, we meet Congress members. They say, well, you people are very articulate, but we don't really hear from our constituents about this very much. Hint, hint. Okay? And if they don't hear from their constituents about it, can we blame them? Well, yes, I guess we can, but it would make it easier for them politically if they did hear from constituents. It's also true that only 17% of the public is like me, who they classify as the alarmed American public on climate change. These are people who say, I'm willing to write a letter, I'm willing to go to a meeting, I'm willing to vote on the basis of this issue. Only 17%. But think about it. That's 40 million Americans, 17% of the voting age population. What if only 1/4 of the 17% got organized and did vote and did do things, communicated with Washington? What kind of political force would that be? Well, for comparison, here are 3 other well-known and fairly effective lobby groups, and how many members they have. 10 million would be 3 times as many as the NRA, or the Chamber of Commerce, or the National Education Association. Second, markets are moving away from carbon. There's a split opening up in the business community between the fossil business and the rest of business. And it's partly driven by shareholders, like CalPERS, the largest public pension plan in the United States, maybe in the world. They own stock in all these companies, and they're starting to worry. What if the oil does have to stay in the ground? The stock price of Exxon and Chevron depends on the value of the reserves in the ground. What if that goes to zero? What happens to the stock price? Oh my goodness, we own those stocks. They're far from going to zero yet, but they're starting to worry about this. So CalPERS joined a number of other big international institutional investors to sign this Montreal Carbon Pledge, which is we pledge to publish the carbon footprint of our investment portfolio and to work with our companies to reduce their emissions and climate risk that they're responsible for. Did you notice in 2014, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund announced they are starting to divest of fossil investments? The same Rockefellers, the descendants of John D., who founded Exxon. Those Rockefellers. And they said, we believe that today John D. the First would agree with us that these are not the best investments for the future. Well, when shareholders and customers start asking questions, boards of directors of companies have to pay some attention. So last year, 154 companies, here's a few of them, signed a pledge calling for a strong Paris Agreement to attack climate change, and they made pledges of their own to cut their own carbon footprints or increase green lending in the case of the banking companies. The costs of solar energy and wind energy are coming down rapidly. Google and GM and Facebook and a number of other companies have started contracting for large, long-term contracts for renewable energy outside the grid or and to get away from fossil energy. Apparently it makes business sense to them. Notice over on the right-hand side at the bottom, Walmart, famous as a conservative company. They've been putting solar panels on a lot of those big buildings since 2005 with their own money and enjoying the subsidies that are paid to everybody who does this. But they apparently think there's a business case for getting off of carbon. I think also a number of these are multinational companies, General Motors, Exxon. They're operating in Europe in lots of places that already have carbon pricing. I think they can see that this train is leaving the station. Europe has had it for a decade now. In fact, even the oil companies today are no longer deniers. They were at one time, but they've all stopped denying it. In fact, this is what Exxon says today about climate risk, climate change. The risk is clear, and the risk warrants action. And the current CEO said in a 2009 speech, in fact, it's not too late for Congress to consider a carbon tax. And in that speech, he used the word dividend as a way to return the revenue to keep it revenue neutral. This summer, ExxonMobil stepped up the lobbying of other oil companies to support the idea of a carbon tax. We might discuss why they did that. Fun parlor game. But the third point was that prominent Republicans are calling for a solution to save us from the risks of climate change. The conservative icon George Shultz, who was Secretary of the Treasury under Nixon, Secretary of State under Reagan, is a member of the advisory board of the Citizens Climate Lobby and favors this proposal. Henry Paulson was Treasury Secretary under George W. Bush. These are all four of the living Republican former directors of the EPA, and they said 3 years ago, we served Republican presidents, but we have a message that transcends political affiliation. The United States must move now on substantive steps to curb climate change at home and internationally. There is no longer any credible scientific debate about the basic facts. These are prominent Republican voices. Do you know Debbie Dooley? Miss Dooley was one of the founders of the Tea Party Patriots in Georgia. Tea Party. And several years back, she got upset at Georgia Power, the utility in Georgia that has a near monopoly and was taking measures to discourage people from putting solar panels on their roofs. And she got very upset and said, this is America. We should be free to do whatever we want with our roofs. And she started campaigning for energy freedom. And she started a partnership with the Sierra Club of Georgia. Sierra Club, Tea Party. They call it the Green Tea Coalition. Why not? They're both uncomfortable, yes, but they agree on this issue. They're campaigning for energy freedom in Georgia. This is a change. This is Jay Faison. He's a self-described Christian conservative Republican in Charlotte, North Carolina, who sold his company, and last year he put $175 million of his money into a campaign to convince other Republicans that our party needs to find a market-oriented solution to climate change. But you might say, all of these Republicans are no longer in Congress, they're no longer in government, and it must be easier for them, okay? Well, yes, but that's not the end of the story. There's also been change in Congress. Last September 2015, the week before the Pope spoke to the Congress about saving our common home, a group of 11, now 13 Republican current House members introduced a public resolution saying the House must do something to find a solution to climate change. 11, now 13 Republican members of Congress speaking out. There were some some Republican senators on the right hand, upper right hand, who already had spoken out and did so further in the fall of 2015. And on the left side, the Democrats in the Senate and House. So you look at these names, you can begin to see the kernel of a bipartisan coalition for climate action. 11 is not enough, but this is how transformations begin. More significant, probably, was last February, two members of the House, one Democrat and one Republican from Florida, formed what they call the Climate Solutions Caucus. It's a bipartisan group. It's up to 20 members now, 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats. They used the word climate in the title deliberately. They did not call it the Clean Energy Caucus or some other less dangerous word. They decided to call it the Climate Solutions Caucus. The Florida Republicans and Democrats leading. They're seeing flooding already. They've had 3 meetings this year. They've been off the record, private meetings, but they've been polite, cooperative, constructive, just like they used to be in Congress, because they're all committed to finding some solution. They're not all from Florida. They're from around the country. By the way, Citizens Climate Lobby worked for over 2 years behind the scenes to encourage, suggest, and help bring about this resolution and this caucus, the formation of this caucus. So we feel we are moving the needle a little anyway. And then international politics have also trended toward more effective climate action. The Paris Agreement last December brought a historic improvement. Now, for the first time, all member states, 195 countries, have made concrete pledges of steps they will take in the 2020s to address climate change. This includes China, developing countries, Iran made a pledge, Russia made a pledge, oil exporting countries, and the United States made a pledge. They agreed to take stock of their collective results after every 5 years and to make new pledges every 5 years that improved on the old ones. I was in Paris at that time. If you're interested in more about the agreement, I can say more about that. 38 countries, by the way, already have carbon pricing. The European Union, Canada's just announced they're going to do it next year. China has had emissions trading experiments going in 6 provinces, and they've announced that they're going to make it national next year. China will have national emissions trading next year. We will not. Okay? But we're behind the scenes. And ExxonMobil operates in all these areas where they already have carbon pricing. Unfortunately, the 2015 pledges that the countries made, if you add them all up and ask how much will they help solve the problem, were not sufficient to save us from climate catastrophe. One of the think tanks produced this chart. Across the bottom, you see the years from 2000 out to 2100. And up the right-hand side is the temperature in 2100, the average global temperature. And they projected 3 things. If there had been no, if the UN were to reach its target and keep global warming from exceeding 2 degrees Celsius, this would be the emissions path. These are emissions on the left-hand side. Emissions would have to start in 2020 and fall very rapidly in order to get to that target. In my opinion, this is very unlikely. Now it's too late. If there were no Paris Agreement, no pledges, no changes in policy, they project global warming would reach 4.5 degrees Celsius, ultra catastrophe. If all of the pledges were implemented from 2020 to 2030, and then they did nothing beyond that, which is what they pledged so far, 3.5 degrees Celsius, well above 2 degrees Celsius, not as bad as 4.5, but still catastrophic. You remember those pictures of Shanghai? This was 2 degrees, when much of the city was underwater. At 4 degrees, virtually the entire city was underwater. And these models do not include those tipping points. If any of that happens, it's way worse. So there's good news and bad news in politics. So I'd like to wrap up with my last point, and then we can have a general discussion. What can one person do, after all, in face of such a big problem? Well, of course, we can reduce our own personal carbon footprints, and my wife and I have solar panels on our roofs. But I believe that if we leave it to volunteers, we will never get the scale of change, enormous scale of change that's needed to address the climate problem. There are just too many people, and especially big companies or little companies that answer to shareholders by law, who cannot volunteer to do more than it makes sense for them. But if it costs them not to change, they will change. The things that our governments do or fail to do in setting a policy framework swamp what we can do with our individual efforts, and that's why I'm a member of Citizens Climate Lobby and working for a public policy solution. So what can one person do beyond that? Well, we can talk. We can even talk to our family and neighbors. Research shows that most of those family members and neighbors never hear from anybody they know about climate change. People don't talk about it. That's a problem, a political problem. Next, we could write a letter, an email, to a member of Congress. The 2 members of Congress from this area are both Democrats, and so they are in the minority. They still need to hear. They need to be reinforced and in contact at all times, even if they're inclined in favor. But actually, two of the most powerful leaders of the U.S. House are right here in Southern California. Ed Royce of Fullerton is the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee today, part of the leadership, and Kevin McCarthy of Bakersfield is the majority leader. He's right under Speaker Paul Ryan. If any of you happens to be a Republican or conservative, everybody can help, but if you write to one of these guys and say, I'd like to support you, our party needs to move on this, might even have more impact than some of the rest of us. You could call your city council member and invite him or her to speak out for the city. If the city of Claremont were to endorse this proposal, it would amplify that much more the signals to members of Congress that the public really wants this. That would be joining a number of other cities that have already endorsed it: Berkeley, Morro Bay, Modesto, Santa Monica, and the state of California in August endorsed essentially the carbon fee and dividend idea in a resolution passed and sent to Congress. Any members of the City Council here tonight? One, two. Thank you for coming. I'm honored that you're here. There they are. Also, you could ask the most famous climate scientist in the country, what can an individual do to help make a difference? I like this one especially. He said, most impressive is the work of Citizens Climate Lobby. If you want to join the fight to save the planet, to save creation for your grandchildren, there is no more effective step you could take than becoming an active member of this group. So there actually is a group designed to mobilize the 40 million. It's a nonpartisan organization by design, nonprofit, no dues, over 300 chapters organized across the United States, Canada, and moving into other countries. One right here, and some of its members are here tonight. Everybody who's here is a CCLer. Raise your hand, please. Okay, if you want to talk to somebody about what this organization is like, there they are. Talk to them. That website up there, citizensclimatelobby.org, it summarizes this proposal if you didn't have to memorize it tonight. And also there is, you can see a phone call, a Wednesday night free telephone call that you can call in and listen to a briefing about the organization. And typically before the election, there were around 25 people or so nationwide on the call every week. On November the 9th, 70 people were on the call. The week after that, 200 people called in the Citizens Climate Lobby call. The same thing has been happening with the Sierra Club, Environmental Defense Fund, Natural Resources Defense Council since the election. We also, our organization has been doubling in actual membership every year for the last 3 years. Early in 2016, we got a big grant from the MacArthur Foundation because we are showing results and we're able to document to them what happens when members start working. And what do we do? Well, we do meet once a month in a chapter meeting, and the next meeting here in Claremont is this Saturday at Pilgrim Place, 9:30 in the morning. And besides chapter meetings, what do we do? Well, we speak and listen to other citizens, including people that don't agree with us, and try to offer a solution, a pragmatic solution based on research that is designed to appeal to both conservatives and progressives. Some of us go to farmers markets, talk to people face to face. Some of us write letters to the editor and op-eds and send them to the media. Some give talks like this. Some go in small groups to meet with local congressional staff right here nearby during the year to vocalize our points of view. So if you're interested in doing a little more, you might look into talking to these folks and signing up tonight on the sign-up sheet. And if you're really ambitious and dedicated, we go to Washington every year in June to lobby Congress in person, face-to-face. Last June, there were about 900 of us there on our own dime. And when you travel to Washington on your own dime, they do meet with you. I can guarantee it, of course, if you're constituents. And I've spoken to both Republican offices and Democratic offices. If you're interested in what has happened in those meetings, I'd be glad to talk about that as well. But I can tell you that even if most Americans have not yet heard of the Citizens Climate Lobby, virtually every congressional office has heard about us because we've been in their office every June for 6-7 years, and during the year in the home offices. So I'll conclude where I began. We have procrastinated for 25 years since we learned about this. As Bill McKibben has said, the real contest is not between Democrats and Republicans, it's between human beings and physics. And physics does not negotiate deals. Anybody here know a 5-year-old in your family or neighborhood? Yeah, okay. Well, these Americans will live on an average of 80 years. That means 2091. And millions of them will live longer than average, and we'll see the 22nd century. So when we're looking at 2100, it sounds like a long way away. It's a slow-moving crisis, but it's people we know and love. Yes, there is a powerful lobby working on the other side, representing a very small number of Americans, but with a lot of resources. But that's why all the rest of us, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Greens, need to join together and work together. And I believe that our government in Washington is going to flip on this issue. I don't know when, but we know that it has happened before. You think back 10 years ago, it was illegal for gays and lesbians to marry. Like 10 years. 25 years ago, it was legal to smoke in bars and restaurants, secondhand smoke. And 100 years ago, the men wouldn't let the women vote until the day they changed their minds. And all three of those major transformations took place after people like us got organized and vocalized our demand over and over again. And yes, it could be that the election of Donald Trump is bad news for this movement. If it means that a setback for 2 years or 4 years, that's bad news. But it's better than 8 more years. Are we going to quit? Certainly not. Please help. Thank you very much.